use the regular greeting. Welcome to the Pandemic Pinup Happy Hour, where y'all get to tune in and watch the unnecessary amount of cocktails that Chandler is making through the pandemic that she shares with people to feel sane. And yes, I am talking about myself in the third person today, but now I'm done. I'm not going to do that anymore because that's like really terrible. If you're a person that does that on the regular, stop. But we are on part 2 of the 12 cocktails of Christmas. I love the holidays, not just Christmas specifically, but I love the holidays. I love reasons to celebrate. And I understand there's a lot of people out there that are not feeling very celebratory or festive, but a few drinks can very easily fix that. So I'm here to provide you with a wealth of drinks before Christmas. So last year, feels like last week we did 3, and today we're going to do another 3, and next week we'll do another 3, and so forth until we reach 12 cocktails on the weekend right before Christmas. Today's cocktails are kind of, I don't want to say run of the mill, but each class that I'm doing for the 12 cocktails of Christmas, like last week's had like their own little theme of like how to gear up for the holidays, how to have like party cocktails if you are having guests, even if it's just 1 or 2. But today, the cocktails we're making are things I want to sip on when I'm at home. Although there's one exception, but we'll get into that. So I'm making 3 cocktails as we usually do here. We're going to be making a lump of coal. We're going to be making something I call Blitzed. And we're also going to be making the stocking stuffer, not to be confused with actual stocking stuffers. Please, as my public service announcement of the day, do not pour this cocktail directly into your stocking. It's not a good idea. Pour directly into your face because that's where it's supposed to go. So I thought we would start off easy with a lump of coal for all of you naughty people out there that have maybe not behaved as well as you should have in 2020. But I feel like Santa will have to let a lot of things go because 2020 has been interesting. Let's go with that. Interesting is that word that you use when it's not good. It's not necessarily like the world is burning to the ground, even though it is. It's just interesting. When you have no other words to use, you use that one. So 2020 has been interesting. So let's make a lump of coal. This is a very simple cocktail. As I said before, the cocktails we're making today are things I would sip at home. However, this particular recipe is also really cool because it works as a really festive shot if you are with friends that like doing shots. That being said, the cocktail is not designed to take as a shooter. The size is, but it's not designed for that. It is more inspired by European countries that have the culture of sitting with a liqueur or a more intensely flavored alcohol rather than just in like plain spirit to sit and sip through the night or sip after dinner. So when I visited Italy many years ago, they have a very large spun tradition of sipping amaros and coffee after dinner. They act as a digestif or an aperitif, depending on when you drink them within your meal, which helps to open the appetite or help you digest the food you've already had. So that was kind of what I wanted to do. And as y'all know, I love coffee a little too much. But I feel like coffee is a very misunderstood beast. As common as it is in countries across the world, it's kind of interesting when you find someone who drinks coffee and then you ask them like, oh, well, what's your favorite coffee or what do you like about coffee? And you always hear the same notes about coffee. It's bitter, it's dark, it can be astringent. But when you really dive into coffee, depending on the region that it's from, it can be a very beautiful, complex flavor that has floral notes or fruity notes or spice notes. So I wanted to create a cocktail that was kind of a gateway into liking darker coffees. So I wanted to add floral and fruity notes to a coffee liqueur, which aren't necessarily always there. That being said, though, I have discovered Mr. Black coffee liqueur finally after hearing about it without fail. Like every time I talk to somebody about coffee liquor within the pandemic, I hear about Mr. Black. So I finally found a bottle. And I'm gonna say I really like it. It's not overly sweet. It's got a beautiful, robust coffee flavor without being bitter. and without punching you in the mouth to where you can't sip on it. But I will say also, I'm mildly disappointed because I know that they have these special bottles that are specific regions. So it's like this one is their flagship coffee liqueur, but they have like an Ethiopian coffee liqueur. And I was really hoping to be able to find those, but they are not available in my market currently. So we're working with just the standard one, and then the cocktail that I'm going to make is going to add in other notes of flavor. So this cocktail is a stirred cocktail. You can make this with any other coffee liqueur if that's what you have on hand. I know a lot of people are familiar with Kahlua. In past classes that I've done, I like to use grind coffee liqueur. It's more of an espresso infused rum than it is a liqueur. I will say I haven't really decided if I like Mr. Black or grind more. Grind is mildly sweeter, and then but the notes are a little different because the grind is a espresso infused rum. It has a little bit more of a caramel and spice note on that back end than Mr. Coffee does, but they're both beautiful. I like them both more than I do Kahlua, I will say that. But that doesn't mean Kahlua is a bad coffee liqueur. It's just my personal preference. So what we're going to do, this is a little shooter. So I know these numbers are going to seem small, but that is why. We're going to start with our coffee liqueur. And we're going to do a 3/4 ounce. And we're just going to pour it directly into our shaker as the bartender of this class remembers that before she signed in, she was supposed to get ice. You're supposed to get ice to make cocktails, guys. The holidays are rough. I will be right back with a bucket full of ice. I think it's because I have it in a cooler, like an ice chest. That's why I forgot to bring it. I'll be right back. Ugh. Have no fear. The ice is here. I actually forgot ice. Because I live with two people that had a cocktail fest last night and drank their way through my entire ice stock. And I got ice on my way home, and then I put it in a cooler and left it in my living room. So back to what we were doing. I am a professional, I promise. But we have a 3/4 ounce of ice in our mixing glass. If you are going to make this cocktail and you don't have a mixing glass, don't worry. You can use literally anything. A glass measuring cup, a mason jar, a Yeti, a pint glass. You can use whatever you want. But I will say, if you are newer to stirring a cocktail, the straighter the walls of your vessel, the easier it will be. So whatever your vessel may be, you're going to add in that 3/4 ounce of coffee liqueur. We're going to add in a 1/2 ounce of tawny port. And y'all might remember a few classes ago, I did another cocktail that featured port. I love port wines. I absolutely love port wines. And the two most common ones are ruby and tawny. They are not identical, but they are similar enough in the sense that you could substitute them in a cocktail instead of like, I don't have port, let me use Cabernet. That texture, that flavor, that richness, that deepness that you get from port isn't going to be there with like a Cabernet or a Malbec or any other red wine. You definitely need to go with a fortified wine. So we're going to use a 1/2 ounce of tawny port. And then we're going to do something that hasn't been done on the Pandemic Pinup Happy Hour before. We're going to use an unregulated measurement. So if you've ever become friends with a bartender, or perhaps you've watched a video or two on YouTube, or maybe you've seen it in a recipe, although I will say I've never seen this actually written down. Sometimes people in our line of work will use the phrase a fat blank amount of an ounce. So what that means is if I say a fat 1/4 ounce, that means it's kind of like a quarter ounce and then a little scoosh. Like it's not enough to make it a half ounce, but it's also not a super determinate amount. And it's something that gets in. It's kind of like when you talk to your mom and you ask her how she made something. She's like, oh, I put in, about a handful of this. Her hands are different from your hands. So there's always going to be a little bit of variable. So we are going to use a fat quarter ounce of elderflower liqueur. If you want to try and get it just right, you would use a quarter ounce and a bar spoon. But all bar spoons are not created equal. That's why we're going with a fat quarter ounce. If you happen to have a jigger that is also metric or divided into thirds, then you would be using approximately a third of an ounce of elderflower liqueur. Now, that being said, elderflower liqueurs are wildly different across the board. They're all floral, yes, but they vary in sweetness so very much that it is not even funny. Brand to brand, they are across the board, just like all over the place. So Saint Germain is probably one of the most commonplace brands that most people are familiar with when it comes to elderflower liqueur. I really like a brand called Il Fiorente. It's an Italian brand. It's really nice. It's not as sweet. And I prefer things that aren't as sweet because that allows me more control. I can always add simple syrup. I can always add more liqueur. But if you have a liqueur or a base that is already super sweet, it's kind of like adding too much salt to a dish. There's not a whole lot you can do once it's already gone too far. So the one I'm using today, just for reference purposes, not that I'm recommending this particular brand, is called Saint Elder. I picked it up because it was on sale. It's not bad. It's less sweet than the Saint Germain. I do like it. I can't say it's my favorite I've ever had, but definitely would probably buy this before I buy Saint Germain, although the Saint Germain bottle is very pretty. So we're going to use a fat quarter ounce of elderflower liqueur. And if you're wondering how much goes in like a bar spoon, because I had said the quarter ounce and then a bar spoon of elderflower liqueur, the average bar spoon is about 1/8 of an ounce, but again, it depends on the brand that you bought, the style of the cocktail bar spoon that you have. So it's just kind of a rough estimate. So if you make this and you feel like it could use a little more, add a little more. If you make it and you feel like it could use a little less, use a little less. So we have those 3 ingredients in our mixing glass. This is not a very large cocktail. We're going to only fill this up about halfway with ice. And then we're going to stir. And if you weren't a part of the classes where I've taught how to stir, it's not a complicated thing, but most people that have never stirred before like to really use their shoulder and their elbow. Number 1, not great for them. Number 2, it'll make you tired if you were actually doing this in a real life scenario where you do this all day. But the actual technique is all in the wrist. So the domed back side of your spoon goes inside your mixing glass or container, pressed against the back, and then you dip it in and you're going to stir, basically tracing the inside of your mixing glass. And if you can see, mostly my wrist is moving. My elbow has a tiny bit of movement, but it's primarily just my wrist. And it's kind of like holding a pencil. I like to hold it between like my first finger and on top of my second finger. So like if I was writing, and that gives me a lot of control. Other people with different sized hands, I've met a lot of bartenders that like to hold it between the top 2 fingers would be here, and then that control finger would be on the 3rd finger. It takes a little bit of practice just to find whatever style works for you. There's really not a right way or a wrong way when it comes to how to hold it, as long as you're able to stir it correctly. So if you were able to stir it correctly doing this, cool. Good luck trying to. It's going to be really hard to get it to trace the glass like that. So pencil, put it in, and then just trace the outside of the glass. And then when you're trying to figure out about how long to stir it, it's more about temperature and dilution. So some people will do 20 stirs, 30 stirs. It's really based drink to drink. It's also going to depend on the proof of your coffee liqueur, the proof of your elderflower, and the proof of your tawny port. So for this one, I usually stir about 35 to 40 times. And if you're not sure, now is the time to check before we pour it into a glass. So I'm at home, I can do it this way. where I take just a little bit of out with the spoon, I put it on the back of my hand, and I taste it. And that'll tell me if it needs more dilution. If it feels like just straight alcohol, then it is way too strong, needs a little more dilution. If it feels very watery, then I've probably gone too far. So this is just about perfect. That means I'm going to go ahead and strain it. If you're in a format where people are watching you, just straw test it, where you like hold the top of the spoon to get a little drop, put it in your mouth. So I'm going to pour this in this adorable little cordial glass that I have, super tiny. Now this will make more than this cordial. This will, I want to say it makes about 2 ounces and a quarter, give or take, of drinks or shots, if you will. But these little cordial glasses are something that aren't really used a lot in today's society. But when you were drinking back in the day, 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, something that was meant to be sipped on, but you wanted to keep that temperature and not let it warm up, you'd have a tiny little cordial glass. It's kind of like the difference between drinking red wine in that big bulbous glass that allows you to get all those aromas, allows that temperature and that air to come in to aerate it, versus like the champagne glass, which is a tall, skinny flute that helps it maintain its bubbles and its temperature a lot longer. So tiny little glass, or even a shot glass at this point, if that's what you have at home. And then you're just going to sip on it. And I made a cute little orange garnish, not that it needed it, but this cocktail does benefit really nicely from just an expression of orange peel. So I wanted to take a moment to show y'all how to do that. I don't believe we've really done that on the class, but most bartenders use a Y-shaped peeler, said or called such because it looks like the letter Y. The other ones are more like a P. But you would take a swath of orange, which is just a piece of the peel, and then you would skin side out or above the cocktail in this case. You're going to hold your fingers like this, hold it over the cocktail, and just kind of squeeze it. And you'll actually, if you're watching your cocktail, see like little sparkles hit the top of your cocktail. And that's the oils coming from the orange peel and just falling on top of the cocktail. Now in this case, I'm going to discard this one because I have this really pretty little garnish. Let me show you our tiny little lump of coal. I like to call it lump of coal because it's small and because you've been very, very naughty during the Christmas season. That's all you get. You get one little lump of coal. Nothing more, nothing less. Cheers. It's actually really tasty. So what I really like about this is if you've never had different varieties of coffee, and you've heard somebody talk about, oh, this coffee has floral notes, or, oh, this coffee is kind of fruity, and you don't know what that means, or you don't know how to look for it when you're tasting it, this cocktail has both of those things, and you can still taste the coffee in a nice way. It makes it brighter. It makes it a little bit more appealing to the palate because it's got a little of that sugar added from the liqueur. Super polite. Oh, yeah. So, yes. Cordial glass, super polite glass. We have this running joke with my group of friends that anything cordial is super polite. I was in Stitched Sides yesterday laughing about the play on words. But it is really interesting. I think the cocktail or the shooter itself has a really nice flavor. It's something you can sip on. If you shoot it, you're not going to be able to appreciate all of the flavor notes that come through, but it still works. If you wanted to just take it as a shot, you absolutely could. It'll go down smooth, nice and easy, get you a little buzz. But when you make this cocktail, if you make this cocktail, I would really hope that you drink it and really pay attention to how the floral and fruity plays with the coffee. And the next time when you have coffee, have a black coffee and see if you can find any fruity or floral notes. And then maybe you really get into exploring coffee because coffee can have that in and of itself. So if I had been able to find one of the regional styles of Mr. Black coffee liqueur, then I might have altered what spirits I was putting in there to create more floral or fruity tones to complement that coffee better. But because this one is just kind of a basic coffee that everybody can get into, then I was able to add in those elements myself. So that is the lump of coal. We're gonna move forward to the stocking stuffer. And this is meant to be sort of in the strain of a mule. I wanted to make something that wasn't wildly sweet. I don't know why mules have become so sweet everywhere I go. I try one and they're just so much sugar, so much sugar. And I think part of it is the ginger beer they're picking. Ginger beers can be super spicy, they can be super sweet. But if you don't have control over your ginger beer, maybe you don't have a lot of variety. The one I'm going to use today is one called Regatta. It's a craft ginger beer from somewhere. It says Bermuda Stone. I don't think that's an actual place. I'm not entirely sure. But New York. Okay, it's from New York. So it's called Regatta. It's kind of middle of the road, but leaning more towards sweet. I really like Cock and Bull. It has a nice spicy ginger note to it. But we're going to be using a really interesting ingredient for the stocking stuffer. We're going to be using date syrup. If you are close to any ethnic grocery stores, specifically Middle Eastern, Indian, or the occasional Asian grocery store might have it. You'll be able to find it. It'll look kind of like molasses or really dark honey, most likely in a jar. That version is going to be a little bit sweeter than the recipe that I put out in the flyer this week. So if you don't have access to it, it's very easy to make. You take dried dates, you take the seeds out, you chop them up roughly, nothing super fancy. And you're going to soak them first in hot water. And then that first hot water you're going to discard. Why? I don't know, because that's how the cultures that make this make it. And I'm not going to question it because that is a product from their culture. I haven't actually had the time to experiment whether soaking and discarding or just using that soak water is better. So if you do, let me know. But you soak them, you discard that water, and then you there is a measurement, I put it on the flyer, but it's usually like 1-to-4 ratio, 1 part being dates, 4 parts being the water, and you let it simmer for a very long time. And then you strain it out, and it's kind of a syrupy liquid. You also have the option of blending it together and straining it and therefore you get a more dense liquid. I like to strain it. I like the texture. It comes out really smooth, similar to like a tamarind paste, if you're familiar with that. And then the flavor is just mildly more intense. But you don't have to blend it. You can just use the simmer liquid. That being said, dates are very sweet. Date syrup, when made this way, is actually quite mild. So it's really nice. It takes this cocktail into the sweet area without being cloying, without being overpowering, to where you can drink multiples. So to make this cocktail, we're going to use a handy dandy shaker. And we're going to use some spiced rum. Today I've got a very dark spiced rum, Kraken. I know this is all over the place in a lot of different markets. So there are different kinds of spiced rum, right? The very household names, you have Kraken, Sailor Jerry, Captain Morgan. I want to say those are like the top 3. Some of the other brands out there that are very popular, such as Bacardi or Malibu, actually make some spiced rums on occasion. No one spiced rum is necessarily better than the other for this particular cocktail. I did try this with Captain Morgan. I liked it a lot. I really enjoyed the deeper notes that are in the Kraken for this cocktail. Use whatever you have. If you don't have spiced rum, just use rum. You can use silver rum. You can use an aged rum. Aged rum would definitely probably be closer because it's got a darker flavor profile than the silver rum. So we're going to use 1.5 ounces of our spiced rum. Kraken's also one of those rums that I feel like a lot of people buy after trying Captain Morgan and think it's going to be the same but better just because it's darker for some reason. I've had people tell me this a lot, and they're like, it's really intense. It's very strong. I don't know what to do with it. It's been sitting in my bar forever. So try this. But if you also have Kraken and don't know what to do with it, it makes a decent like ginger beer and rum drink. It goes well in orange juice, but with a higher orange juice ratio than other rums. It's kind of a personal preference thing. Soda is also really nice. If you do find it really intense, soda will kind of like water that down, but still maintain a lot of the flavor profile. What about making your own spiced rum? Fantastic question. Yes, you can make your own spiced rum. If you have a rum you really like, if you've tuned into a lot of these, a lot of people know that one of my favorite rums is the Flor de Caña out of Nicaragua, and I love their 7-year rum. It's fantastic. If you want to make your own spiced rum, there are so many great ways to do that, and then you also have control over what spices go in. So you could pick a mulling spice base where it's already blended, and it usually has clove, allspice, cinnamon, some dried apples, some orange peel, and just toss that in your rum and then taste it every so many days or every so many hours. And when it gets to the flavor that you like, strain out all the solids. Or if you just really love cardamom, I am one of those people. I adore cardamom. You could just put a whole bunch of cardamom in there and then taste it as you go. And once it hits that flavor, then you strain out the cardamom. There are ratios that would be a good suggestion. It kind of depends on how much you're making. So I like to tell people to start with like a 1-4 or a 1-6 ratio. So if you're doing 1 tablespoon of cardamom, which is a lot of cardamom, then start with 6 tablespoons of rum. And it might only need 4 hours, but maybe you don't think it has enough spice and you let it sit overnight. So it's a lot about personal preference, but making your own spiced rums means you can also add in other complementary notes. So you could add in a vanilla bean. You can add in things like dried apples if you plan to use it in things like cider. You can add in dried citrus peels. You can add in something a little more wild like a dried hibiscus flower and get a little bit more floral and a little bit more of a tartness to that end finish on that rum. So you can definitely make your own spiced rum. Use any rum that you like, any one that you have available. I will say, if you use a silver rum, you're going to notice a little more bitterness because the rum itself doesn't have natural vanilla and caramel notes to it to round out the spice flavors. So if you are making your own spiced rum, buy a darker aged rum. That would be my current suggestion. So we have our 1.5 ounces of the spiced rum. We're going to use a 1/2 ounce of the date syrup. And again, mine is blended. You definitely don't have to blend yours. We're going to use a 1/2 ounce of freshly squeezed lime juice. That in there. And then we're going to use 1 dash of orange bitters. Oh, goodness. I can just stay there. This is my house. I'll pick it up later. And then we're actually going to muddle something in this drink. We're going to take an orange peel, and I'm going to get a fairly large swath. I'll show you guys what it looks like here in a sec. I would say it's about 2.5 inches, give or take, maybe 3. And then I'm going to just tear this in 2 so that it's easier for me to muddle. I'm going to put it directly into my cocktail shaker and my handy dandy muddler. If you don't have one of these, the stem of a wooden spoon works really, really well. So you're just going to press it a little bit. I like to press and like rotate my wrist just a little bit to really get those oils out, maybe about 5 or 6 times. Leave that in there. That over to the side. And then we're going to add some ice and shake it. Okay, and you want to fill your shaker about 2/3 of the way with ice. It's a little different if you're using a home vessel like a mason jar because maybe your mason jar is really big, so you don't necessarily have to fill it all the way with ice. You're just trying to dilute and chill your cocktail. So we're going to shake it for about 10 seconds. I got talked to about my shaking method the other day, so I'm going to try something different. How's this, Ozzy? I do this a lot, guys. Force a habit. All right. So like I said before, this is kind of in the strain of a mule. And if you know what goes in a mule, it's usually ginger beer. I made this with ginger beer. I thought it was a little too sweet. Not too much, but just enough. So I'm going to do a 1/2 and 1/2 mixer base. So I'm pouring equal parts sparkling water. I'm using Topo Chico today, but you could also use a tonic, a club soda, any other sparkling water brand that you prefer, and a ginger beer. So use your 2 favorite brands, and then equal parts. I do about 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces of each. Kind of depends on what glass I'm putting this in. I'm putting this in this very festive snowflake covered highball. I'm going to fill my highball with ice, and then I'm going to strain this cocktail into it. All right. Nothing too crazy, just a Hawthorne strainer. your standard cocktail strainer that you see in a lot of places. And one of the reasons I like to pour my mixers into the shaker is that it helps it mix twice. So instead of having to like pour it back and forth or stir it all together, I've poured them in and they're kind of looping around in the shaker. And then when I pour them into the glass, they're mixing a second time. So it ends up being a really uniform flavor. So I have that poured into my highball. And then I'm going to garnish it, partially because it's Christmas, but also because there's lime in there. I'm going to use a green lime. There we go. That is the stocking stuffer. And you are also welcome to serve this in a Moscow Mule mug, those little copper mugs. It would look really nice and festive. I know Walmart has some really pretty red ones right now. But this is really nice. It's not super sweet. The date really comes through, surprisingly, even though we use a very small amount. And then depending on what rum you use and what ginger beer you use, those flavor profiles are going to be a little bit spicier or a little bit more mellow. So you can really adjust that to your personal preference. But this is the stocking stuffer. All right, and the last cocktail of our 12 cocktails of Christmas installment that we're doing today is something I like to call Blitzed, which is kind of a nod to Blitzen, the reindeer, but also Blitz, being a play on words when you're like very, very tipsy. This cocktail's got a lot of stuff going on. So if you drink more than one, you definitely will be blitzed. But maybe that's just kind of your goal for the night, to be blitzed. So you do drink more than one. So what we're going to do, we're going to make kind of a whiskey sour, but with a lot of extra stuff in it. I have made a ton of fizzes, I think, on these glasses. I love egg white cocktails. I love things that are frothy, but I love also flips. If you don't know what a flip is, it's a different technique where instead of using the egg white only, you have the option of using the whole egg or just the egg yolk. Now, if you like it less frothy, just use the egg yolk. If you like that rich, velvety feel that the egg yolk gives you and the really frothy, nice, creamy head on top, then you want to use the whole egg. So we're going to make a whiskey sour-ish. We're going to add a bunch of other ingredients in there, and then we're going to do the whole egg vibe because it makes it very rich in a sense, kind of reminiscent of like a nog, but it also just kind of makes it really velvety and fun to drink. So you will need another cocktail shaker. And I'm going to be using Woodford Reserve bourbon for this one today. You can use, I've made this cocktail a couple times. I've also made it with blended whiskeys, and that works really, really well. Irish whiskey kind of falls flat. Ryes tend to be a little too spicy, but blended whiskeys, depending on the brand, and bourbons, nice bourbons, work really well. So we're going to use 1.5 ounces of Woodford Reserve bourbon. And then we're going to use one of my favorite Italian spirits, which is Aperol. It's got a little bit of a bitterness to it. It's got some really bright orange flavors that are also really nice. So we're going to use 1/2 ounce of that. And then we're going to use some red wine. Now, the recipe calls for Tempranillo. Tempranillo is not a wine that a lot of people have or are familiar with. Can you make this with another red wine? Absolutely. You can use Cabernet. You can use Malbec. You can use a Pinot Noir. But surprisingly, for some people out there, even though we're only going to use 1/2 ounce of the red wine, the choice in red wine will alter this cocktail so much that it becomes a different cocktail, just mouthfeel wise and flavor profile. Because if you think of like something like a Cabernet, it has an astringency factor to it that kind of dries out your palate. It's a drier red wine, whereas Merlots and Pinot Noirs are a little sweeter than a Cabernet. They're not necessarily sweet wines, but they are sweeter than a Cabernet. You can drink them without having that effect. So when you change those wines, it's going to change the mouthfeel of the cocktail. It's going to change how dry or how sweet it feels. And it's also going to change that flavor profile. A lot of Cabernets tend to be really bold, whereas a lot of other red wines can also be kind of mellow and shy and flirty. So you just have to pick what red wine you prefer, but my recommendation is a Tempranillo. So we're going to use 1/2 ounce of Tempranillo, and then we're going to add 1/4 ounce of lemon juice, freshly squeezed preferably. And then we have a honey syrup that I made Honey syrup, very basic. I just take 1 part hot water, 1 part honey, mix them together until it's all uniform, and then that's my honey syrup. Nothing fancy, guys. 1/2 ounce of that. Pour that into the shaker. And then, like I said, we're using a whole egg. A whole egg, so we get that nog kind of richness, velvety texture at the end. So I have a whole egg right here, yolk and white, pouring that in. And we're going to do the traditional dry shake and then add ice, because that's what I like to do. And whoever says different can just make their own cocktail. But I'm making this for me. So you shake it with that ice. And I'm going to shake it for probably about 10 seconds, maybe 15. Really trying to break up that egg yolk. Kind of separate some of those proteins and the albumin of the egg white. And then we're going to open our shaker and add some ice. And same thing, you want to think about if you're filling this part of your shaker, but you're adding about 2/3 part of ice. And then we're going to shake it again. And this ice is very different from my fridge ice. My fridge ice is compact. It comes out in normal shapes, all are the same. So shaking times differ depending on your ice. The ice I got at the store is a little slushier. It's all in irregular pieces. So it's diluting a lot faster. So I'm not going to shake it as long. If you have very standard shaped ice, just shake a little bit longer, anywhere between 15 to 20 seconds, as opposed to like 10 to 15. So I have this nice little coupe right here. And I'm going to strain this cocktail directly into my coupe. And although this cocktail itself doesn't really have a whole lot of like baking spice kind of notes that you would expect to come out, the Woodford Reserve bourbon that I'm using does sometimes have those notes in there. They're subtle. It also depends on your palate. Everybody detects different flavor profiles and different things. But I wanted to amp up this cocktail with just a tiny bit of grated nutmeg. It makes the aroma on the cocktail really nice. It complements all of these flavors that are going in there, the red wine. It complements the orange, believe it or not, that Aperol. Orange and baking spice go together really nicely. So just a really light dusting of nutmeg. And that, ladies and gents, naughty and nice people out there, is Blitzed. So cheers. Oh, it's really good. It's really tasty. It's really silky in the sense of, it's kind of hard to explain. It's, if you've never had a flip, it's not creamy. It's not heavy like a cream-based cocktail, but it's not as thin as, say, something that's just like a whiskey sour. So it's kind of that in-between point that's really, really nice. It's not as thick as an eggnog, so if you're thinking like, oh, I don't like eggnog, I don't want to try this cocktail, just dismiss that thought. It is not nearly as thick. It's not nearly as sweet. And again, this is something that I designed for myself to be sipping on at home. So the sweet level is kind of intermediate. It's nice. It complements everything in there, but not so sweet that I would go as far as to call this a dessert cocktail. So as is, I could probably drink 3 or 4 of these. If it was sweeter, it might be 1. So if you drink it and you think you'd like it sweeter, just amp up that honey, or you can even swap out the honey with maple syrup. You can swap it out with just a regular simple syrup, and then that sweetness level will go up just a tad, and maybe it'll hit that sweet spot for you. But that is Blitzed, and that is also our second installment of the 12 Cocktails of Christmas. And next week we'll be doing another 3, and the week after that another 3. So if you aren't feeling festive, jump in on the Zoom, come hang out with us, or creep on Facebook. I know there's a couple people that do that, and that's super cool too. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can find me on Instagram at The Pandemic Pinup. All of these videos get uploaded to the YouTube channel for the Chef at Red Shoes, because I don't have my life together and I have 80,000 handles, but eventually it'll make sense. So if you aren't in the Zoom, unfortunately, we're going to have to let you go so we can sip these drinks all together by our lonesomes. But if you want to hang out next time, just come and join us. Until next Sunday, cheers.